There's a moment in 1798 when Ludwig van Beethoven realizes he's going deaf. He's 27 years old, standing at the edge of becoming the most celebrated composer in Vienna, and his ears are betraying him. The ringing won't stop. Conversations fade into muffled noise. He can still hear music in his head, perfectly, brilliantly, but the world outside is slipping away. Most men would have surrendered. Beethoven wrote a suicide note, locked it in a drawer, and then composed the most revolutionary music the world had ever heard. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how a man could lose his hearing and still transform music forever, we need to go back. Back to a cramped apartment in Bonn, Germany, where a boy is being dragged from his bed in the middle of the night by a father who sees only one path out of poverty. December 1770. The exact date is uncertain, lost to sloppy record-keeping, and a family that had more immediate concerns than documentation. What we know is this. Sometime around the 16th or 17th, Maria Magdalena van Beethoven gave birth to her second surviving child in a second-floor apartment on Borngasse Street. They baptized him Ludwig, after his grandfather, on December 17th. The grandfather had been Kapellmeister, the music director at the court of the Elector of Cologne. That position represented everything the family had lost. Johann van Beethoven, the father, was a tenor in the same court's musical establishment, but where the grandfather had commanded respect, Johann commanded pity. He was a drunk. Not the jovial, social drinker of romantic mythology, but the desperate, mean kind. The kind who spent what little money the family had on wine, who stumbled home late, who saw his children as assets to be exploited rather than people to be raised. The apartment was small, cold in winter, stifling in summer. Ludwig shared it with his mother, his father, and eventually 6 siblings, though only 2 brothers would survive past childhood. Death was a frequent visitor. Maria Magdalena had already buried one Ludwig before this second son arrived. Infant mortality wasn't unusual, but that doesn't mean it didn't hollow out a mother's heart. What Johann noticed about young Ludwig wasn't his potential for joy or his curious mind. It was his ear. The boy could remember melodies after hearing them once. He could pick out harmonies on the clavier, the household keyboard instrument. And Johann, looking at his son, saw Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Mozart had just turned 14 and was already famous across Europe. His father Leopold had paraded him through royal court since age 6, collecting money and prestige. The child prodigy industry was booming. Johann decided his son would be the next sensation. So began the lessons. Not gentle instruction in the afternoon, but brutal training sessions that started before dawn and stretched late into the night. Johann would drag Ludwig from bed at midnight, force him to the keyboard, and keep him there for hours. When the boy's fingers stumbled, his father would hit him. When he cried, his father would hit him harder. The neighbours heard it. Everyone heard it. No one intervened. This is where most stories about Beethoven start to romanticize the struggle. The tortured genius, forged in the fires of adversity. But there's nothing romantic about a 7-year-old being beaten for missing a note. What's remarkable isn't that this abuse created a genius. It's that it didn't destroy one. Because here's what gets overlooked. Johann wasn't actually a good teacher. He was a mediocre musician with a drinking problem trying to manufacture a child prodigy through force. The real musical education came from elsewhere. A man named Tobias Friedrich Pfeiffer moved into the Beethoven household as a boarder. He was an oboist, a friend of Johann's, and most importantly, he was often as drunk as his landlord. The two would drink together, then stumble upstairs to wake Ludwig for midnight practice sessions. 2 drunk men teaching a child to play the piano at 1 a.m. It sounds like a nightmare, and it was. But Pfeiffer, unlike Johann, actually understood music. Then there was Giels van den Eden, the court organist. He gave Ludwig proper lessons in organ and composition. Heinrich Koch taught him violin. Franz Rovantini, a distant relative, instructed him in violin and viola. These men saw something in the boy, that transcended his father's ambitions. They saw someone who didn't just play notes, he felt them. By age 7, Ludwig was good enough for Johann to arrange his first public performance. The announcement claimed the boy was 6, shaving a year off his age to make him seem more precocious. It was a lie that would confuse Beethoven himself for years. He genuinely believed for much of his life that he was born in 1772, not 1770. When the truth finally emerged, he refused to accept it. The concert itself left little impression on history. A small performance in Cologne, a handful of pieces played competently. No one proclaimed the arrival of a genius. The hoped-for fame didn't materialize. Johann kept pushing, kept arranging performances, kept hitting his son when the results disappointed. Meanwhile, Maria Magdalena watched. She was a quiet woman, worn down by poverty and grief. She'd lost 4 children by the time Ludwig turned 8. She suffered her husband's drinking, his violence, his failures, without complaint. What did she think, watching her son's childhood being sacrificed to his father's delusions? We don't know. She left no diary, no letters that survived. She's a ghost in her own son's story. But Ludwig loved her. In later years, when he could barely speak a kind word about anyone, he called her his best friend. The only time he ever mentioned his father in writing, he referred to him simply as the court tenor. Not father, not even by name, just a job title. What saved Ludwig from being completely crushed by this childhood was the same thing that would define his entire life: stubbornness that bordered on the supernatural. Other children might have broken, might have learned to hate music, to associate it only with pain and failure, and their father's fists. Ludwig went the opposite direction. Music became his rebellion. When Johann forced him to play scales, Ludwig would learn entire sonatas. When told to practice what he'd been taught, he'd improvise. By age 10, he was composing his own music, though none of it survives. The act of creation was his escape, the one place his father couldn't fully control. Around this time, a new teacher entered his life. Christian Gottlob Neef had just arrived in Bonn as the new court organist. He was educated, cultured, connected to the broader musical world beyond the provincial court. And when he heard young Beethoven play, he recognized something extraordinary. Neef didn't just teach Ludwig to play, he taught him to think. He introduced him to the works of Bach, to the complex architecture of fugues and counterpoint. He showed him how music could be more than entertainment, how it could be structure and mathematics and emotion all woven together. He gave the boy copies of Bach's well-tempered clavier and watched as Ludwig devoured them, learning to play preludes and fugues that professional musicians found challenging. More importantly, Neef believed in him, not as a performing monkey to generate income, but as a musician with something to say. In 1783, when Ludwig was 12, Neef published a note in a musical magazine. Ludwig van Beethoven, a boy of 11 years, and of most promising talent. He plays the clavier very skillfully and with power, reads at sight very well, and plays chiefly the well-tempered clavier of Sebastian Bach. Whoever knows this collection of preludes and fugues in all the keys will know what this means. Herr Neef has also, so far as his other occupations permitted, given him instruction in thorough bass. He is now training him in composition, and for his encouragement has had 9 variations for the pianoforte, written by him on a march, engraved at Mannheim. Notice that Neef shaved another year off Ludwig's age. Everyone was obsessed with the prodigy narrative. But the important part isn't the age. It's that a respected musician was publicly endorsing this child's talent. It's that Ludwig's first published composition existed because a teacher believed it should. The variations Neef mentioned were based on a march by Ernst Christoph Dressler. They're not masterpieces. They're the work of a talented child learning his craft. But they're also evidence of something else. Ludwig was already thinking in terms of taking existing material and transforming it, finding new possibilities in familiar themes. It's a technique he'd perfect over the next 4 decades. By 13, Ludwig was earning money as a musician, not performing as a child prodigy anymore, but working. Real work. Neef arranged for him to become assistant court organist, substituting when Neef was absent. The salary was tiny, but it was his. Money he earned through his own skill, not his father's exploitation. He was also playing viola in the court orchestra, learning how music worked from the inside, sitting in the middle of an ensemble, surrounded by other instruments, hearing how melodies and harmonies interlocked. This practical education would prove more valuable than any amount of theory instruction. The court orchestra performed operas, lots of operas. Gluck, Mozart, Italian composers whose names have faded from memory. Ludwig absorbed all of it, understanding how drama and music could fuse together, how a human voice could transform a melody, how timing and silence could create tension. At home, things were deteriorating. Johann's drinking had progressed from problem to disaster. He was showing up to court performances drunk. He was becoming unreliable, an embarrassment. The family's financial situation, never stable, was collapsing. Maria Magdalena's health was failing. In 1787, when Ludwig was 16, someone decided he needed to meet Mozart. We don't know exactly who arranged it or why. What we know is that Ludwig travelled to Vienna, the musical capital of Europe, with some vague plan to study with the greatest composer alive. The meeting happened. Probably. The evidence is frustratingly thin. Later accounts claim that Mozart heard Beethoven improvise and said, "Keep your eyes on him. Someday he will give the world something to talk about." It's a perfect story. Too perfect. It probably never happened, at least not like that. What definitely happened is that Ludwig was in Vienna for only a few weeks before receiving devastating news from Bonn. His mother was dying. He rushed home, travelling for days, desperate to reach her before the end. He made it. Barely. Maria Magdalena van Beethoven died of tuberculosis on July 17th, 1787. She was 40 years old. Ludwig was 17, and the one person who had truly loved him unconditionally was gone. Something broke in the family after that. Johann descended further into alcoholism. The household fell apart. Ludwig, still a teenager, became the de facto head of the family. He took over the responsibility of supporting his two younger brothers, Caspar Karl and Nicholas Johann. The child who'd been beaten for musical mistakes was now the man keeping the family from starvation. He continued working at court, playing viola, substituting as organist, teaching piano to children of wealthy families for extra money. Every thaler he earned went to keeping his brothers fed and clothed, to managing his father's debts, to holding together something that increasingly resembled nothing like a home. And through all of this he kept composing, not publishing much, not yet, but writing, learning, growing. The music he created during these years shows a young man wrestling with form and expression, trying to find his own voice while working within the established rules. Then in 1789, something happened that would change everything, though nobody in Bonn realised it at the time. A revolution erupted in France, and the aftershocks would eventually shake loose the entire structure of European society, including one stubborn young musician trapped in a provincial German court. But before the revolution could reach Bonn, before Ludwig could escape, he had to survive, and survival meant navigating a world that was growing stranger by the day. The late 1780s brought new faces to the Bonn court. Max Franz, the Elector, was trying to modernise his little territory. He imported ideas from the Enlightenment, encouraged education, supported the arts. He wasn't a revolutionary, but he was open to reform. Under his patronage, the court became more intellectually ambitious. Reading societies formed, people discussed philosophy, banned books circulated quietly. The rigid certainties of the old order were softening just a little. Ludwig found himself drawn into a circle of young intellectuals who gathered at the home of the von Breuning family. Frau von Breuning, a widow of considerable cultivation, took a protective interest in the awkward young musician. She saw past the rough exterior to something worth nurturing. Her home became a refuge, a place where Ludwig could escape the chaos of his own household and experience something resembling normal family life. He taught piano to her children. He joined their conversations about literature and philosophy. He began reading seriously for the first time, trying to fill the gaps left by his scattered education. He discovered Schiller, Goethe, Homer, Plutarch. The world of ideas opened up, vast and intoxicating. This was also where he began falling in love, repeatedly and hopelessly. There was Jeanette Donrath, a friend of the von Breuning family. Then others. Ludwig's pattern with women would remain consistent throughout his life. He fell hard, idealized them completely, and was inevitably disappointed when reality intruded. The women he chose were usually above his social station, which guaranteed frustration. He would pour his feelings into music rather than successful relationships. The court orchestra gave him steady work, but it wasn't enough. Not creatively, not financially. He was still teaching piano to wealthy children, still supporting his brothers, still managing his father's decline. Johann had become such an embarrassment that in 1789, Ludwig had to petition the Elector for official recognition as head of household. The petition was granted. Ludwig, not yet 20, was legally responsible for his family. Half of his father's court salary was redirected to him. Johann kept drinking. Through all of this, Ludwig kept writing music. The pieces from this period show a young composer trying to master the established forms. Variations on popular themes, piano quartets, songs, nothing revolutionary, but competent, skilled. Occasionally flashes of something more interesting appeared, moments where you could hear a distinctive voice trying to break through the conventional language. What Ludwig needed was exposure to the wider musical world. Bonn was too small. The court orchestra was provincial. He needed to hear what the great composers were actually doing, not just read their scores. He needed teachers who could take him to the next level. He needed Vienna. But Vienna required money, and money required a patron. In 1790, one appeared from an unexpected direction. Joseph Haydn was 60 years old, the most celebrated composer in Europe, and he was travelling from Vienna to London. His route took him through Bonn. The court orchestra performed a cantata Ludwig had written commemorating the death of Emperor Joseph II. Haydn heard it. He was impressed. Not overwhelmed, but impressed enough to suggest that if young Beethoven ever came to Vienna, he should look him up. This was the opening Ludwig had been waiting for. The Elector, influenced by Haydn's recommendation and his own desire to support talented musicians, agreed to provide financial support for Ludwig to study in Vienna. The deal was simple. Ludwig would go to Vienna, study with Haydn, continue receiving his salary from Bonn, and eventually return to serve the court with his improved abilities. November 1792. Ludwig was 21 years old. He packed his belongings, said his goodbyes, and climbed into a coach heading south toward Vienna. He would never live in Bonn again. His father would die within weeks of his departure, alone and forgotten. His brothers would follow him to Vienna later, bringing complications Ludwig couldn't yet imagine. The journey took weeks. The roads were bad, the inns uncomfortable, the company random. Ludwig travelled with several other musicians, including a horn player who would later describe the trip as mostly uneventful, except for Beethoven's constant complaining about everything. They crossed into Austria. The landscape changed, the architecture changed, the accent changed, and then suddenly, Vienna. Imagine arriving in the greatest city you've ever seen. Vienna in 1792 was home to more than 200,000 people, maybe 10 times the size of Bonn. It was the capital of the Habsburg Empire, the seat of emperors, a city of palaces and churches and concert halls. Mozart had died there just a year earlier. Haydn lived there. The best musicians in Europe came there. If you wanted to make a name in music, Vienna was where it happened. Ludwig found lodgings in a small apartment and immediately started working with Haydn. The lessons did not go well. Haydn was busy, distracted, about to leave for London again. He was kind but not particularly attentive. Ludwig, who needed rigorous instruction and constant feedback, felt neglected. He started studying secretly with another teacher, Johann Schenk, getting the detailed technical training that Haydn wasn't providing. The relationship between Haydn and Beethoven would remain cordial but cool. Years later, Ludwig would refuse to describe himself as Haydn's student, insisting he'd learned nothing from the old master. This was unfair and ungrateful, but it reflected genuine frustration. Ludwig had come to Vienna expecting intensive mentorship from the greatest composer alive. What he got was a famous man who was too busy to really teach. But Vienna offered something more important than one teacher. It offered a musical culture unlike anything Ludwig had experienced. Concerts every night, salons where aristocrats gathered to hear new music, publishers looking for fresh compositions, pianists competing to see who could improvise most brilliantly. This was the world Ludwig had been preparing for without knowing it. He started making connections. Baron van Swieten, a music-loving aristocrat, took an interest in him. Prince Lichnowsky, another patron, offered him rooms in his palace and introduced him to influential families. Ludwig's skill at the piano opened doors that his rough manners and suspicious personality would otherwise have kept closed. Because Ludwig was not easy to like. He was prickly, defensive, quick to take offence. He dressed carelessly. His manners were atrocious by Viennese standards. He would show up at aristocratic gatherings looking like he'd slept in his clothes, which he often had. He didn't play the game of flattery and deference that other musicians used to secure patronage. What saved him was his playing. When Ludwig sat at a piano, everything else disappeared. He could improvise for hours, spinning out variations on themes suggested by the audience, building complex musical structures in real time. Other pianists were technically proficient. Ludwig was something else. He didn't just play the piano, he attacked it, wresting music from the instrument with a physical intensity that audiences found thrilling and slightly frightening. His compositions started circulating. Piano trios, sonatas, variations. Publishers began accepting his work. He was building a reputation not just as a performer, but as a composer whose music was worth printing and selling. The pieces from these early Vienna years show him absorbing the classical style of Haydn and Mozart while beginning to push at its boundaries. The forms were conventional. The content was starting to become distinctive. Money was tight. The salary from Bonn helped, but Vienna was expensive. Ludwig taught piano to wealthy students, performed at private concerts, and accepted commissions when they came. He was making a living. Barely. But he was also establishing himself as a serious musician, rather than just another performer passing through. Then in 1794, the French Revolutionary Army occupied the Rhineland. Bonn fell. The electoral court dissolved. Ludwig's salary from Bonn stopped. He was now entirely dependent on what he could earn in Vienna. There would be no going back. The court he'd served no longer existed. The world he'd grown up in was gone, swept away by the revolutionary tide that was reshaping Europe. This should have been a disaster. Instead, it was a liberation. Ludwig was forced to succeed in Vienna or fail completely. The safety net was gone. He responded by working harder, composing more, performing more, pushing himself further. The necessity of survival sharpened his ambition into something fierce and uncompromising. His brothers arrived in Vienna, expecting Ludwig to support them. He did, reluctantly, creating a family dynamic that would cause him endless grief. Caspar Karl and Nikolaus Johann were not talented like their older brother. They were ordinary men, with ordinary abilities trying to make their way in a city that didn't particularly need them. Ludwig felt responsible for them, resented them, loved them, and wished they would leave him alone. They never did. By 1795, Ludwig was becoming famous. He performed his second piano concerto at a public concert, to enormous acclaim. He published his Opus 1, a set of 3 piano trios dedicated to Prince Lichnowsky. The dedication secured him more patronage. The music secured his reputation. Critics noted that here was a composer who understood the classical forms, but was doing something new with them, adding intensity and drama that pushed beyond mere elegance. He was also going deaf, though he didn't know it yet. Or perhaps he knew it, but hadn't admitted it. The first signs were subtle: occasional ringing in the ears, difficulty hearing high frequencies. He dismissed it as temporary, something that would pass. It would not pass. For now, though, in his mid-20s, Ludwig was riding a wave of success. He'd escaped Bonn, survived the transition to Vienna, established himself as a major talent. He was performing for aristocrats, publishing his music, earning enough to live independently. The future looked bright. He had no way of knowing that within a few years, the one thing that made all of this possible, his hearing, would begin to fail catastrophically. But that crisis was still ahead. For now, there was work to do. Music to write, a reputation to build, a voice to find. Ludwig had spent his entire youth being told what to do, how to play, what to compose. He'd survived poverty, abuse, family dissolution, and the collapse of the only world he'd known. He'd made it to Vienna against considerable odds. Now finally, he was going to show them what he could do. Not what his father wanted, not what Haydn expected, not what the aristocrats preferred, what he, Ludwig van Beethoven, believed music could be. The transformation from competent composer to revolutionary force was about to begin. But first he would have to face the one challenge that would test everything he'd built, a challenge that would have destroyed most musicians completely. The realization, slow and terrible, that the sound was fading, that silence was coming, that everything he'd worked for was built on a foundation that was crumbling beneath him. The first time Ludwig noticed something was wrong. He was sitting at the piano in his apartment, working through a new composition. It was 1796, maybe early 1797. He was around 26 years old at the height of his performing career, and he played a passage in the upper register. Nothing. Not complete silence. He could hear the notes, but they sounded muffled, distant, as if someone had stuffed cotton in his ears. He shook his head, tried again. Still muffled. He assumed it was fatigue. He'd been working long hours, performing constantly, barely sleeping. The body needs rest, he ignored it. Weeks passed. The problem didn't go away. Sometimes his ears would ring, a high-pitched tone that wouldn't stop. Other times, everything sounded underwater. He found himself asking people to repeat themselves. At first they obliged without comment. Then they started giving him looks. Confused looks, concerned looks. He told no one. This was not something you admitted. Not in Vienna. Not when your entire career depended on performing, on hearing every nuance of every phrase, on responding in real time to other musicians. Deafness for a composer was like blindness for a painter. It was career death. So Ludwig kept quiet and hoped it would resolve itself. It got worse. By 1798, he could barely hear conversation unless people spoke directly at him, loudly. He started avoiding social situations. The brilliant conversationalist who charmed aristocratic salons became withdrawn, irritable, paranoid. People thought he was being rude. He was actually struggling to understand what they were saying. High frequencies disappeared first. Then mid-range sounds started to fade. Music, the one thing that had made his entire miserable childhood worthwhile, was becoming harder to hear. He could still compose. The music was in his head, always had been, but performing was agony. Sitting at the piano in front of an audience, uncertain whether he was playing the right dynamics, whether the other instruments were following him, whether he was even in tune. He consulted doctors. They had no idea what was causing it. Medical science in 1800 understood almost nothing about hearing loss. They prescribed almond oil in his ears, They suggested he avoid drafts. One recommended tying pieces of bark soaked in medicine to his arms. None of it worked. The desperation was absolute. This wasn't just his career collapsing. It was his identity. Music was the only thing Ludwig had ever been good at, the only thing that justified his existence, the only language through which he could express what he felt. And it was being taken from him, slowly, inexorably, note by note. In October 1802, Ludwig left Vienna for Heiligenstadt, a small village outside the city. He was supposed to be resting, following doctor's orders to give his ears a break from the noise of urban life. Instead, he fell into the darkest depression of his life. He was 31 years old, unmarried, increasingly isolated, going deaf. The future stretched ahead like a prison sentence. What was the point of living if he couldn't hear? What was the point of composing if he couldn't perform? What was the point of anything? He wrote a letter, not to send, to explain, to document, to leave behind. The Heiligenstadt Testament, as it would later be called, was addressed to his brothers, but really written to the world. It's one of the most heartbreaking documents any artist has ever produced. In it, Ludwig explained why he'd become so withdrawn, so difficult, so seemingly arrogant. He wasn't being antisocial. He was hiding a disability that would destroy his reputation if discovered. "For me, there can be no recreation in the company of my fellows," he wrote. "I must live like an exile." He described the torture of standing next to someone who could hear a distant flute, while he heard nothing. The humiliation of having to admit that the one sense most essential to his art was failing. He contemplated suicide. Seriously. What held him back? It seemed impossible to leave this world before I had produced all the works I felt called upon to produce. The music kept him alive. Something happened at Heiligenstadt. We don't know exactly what. Some internal shift, some decision. Ludwig returned to Vienna in autumn 1802, a different person. Not happier, not reconciled to his deafness, but determined. If he was going to lose his hearing, he would compose music so powerful that it wouldn't matter. Music that transcended sound. Music that grabbed you by the throat and forced you to feel what he felt. The works that followed announced a new Beethoven. The Third Symphony, the Eroica, completed in 1803, was unlike anything written before. It was longer than any previous symphony, more ambitious, more emotionally raw. It didn't politely entertain aristocratic audiences. It demanded their complete attention and refused to let go. The opening two chords hit like a declaration of war. This was not your grandfather's symphony. This was music that wrestled with fate, with heroism, with mortality. Critics were baffled. Some loved it. Others thought Ludwig had lost his mind. The piece was too long, too complex, too intense. It violated every rule of classical form. Ludwig didn't care. He wasn't writing for them anymore. He was writing for himself, for posterity, for anyone who would listen 100 years later. The rules of classical music, the elegant structures of Haydn and Mozart, suddenly felt too small to contain what he needed to say. He originally dedicated the Eroica to Napoleon Bonaparte, seeing in the French general a champion of liberty and revolutionary ideals. When Napoleon crowned himself emperor in 1804, Ludwig flew into a rage. He scratched out the dedication so violently he tore through the paper. No more heroes, only music. His personal life remained a disaster. He fell in love constantly, always with women who were either unavailable or uninterested. There was Giulietta Guicciardi, for whom he wrote the Moonlight Sonata. She was a student, young and beautiful. She married someone else. There was Josephine Brunswick. She was widowed, vulnerable. They had a brief affair. It ended. There would be others, all futile. The pattern was obvious to everyone but Ludwig. He fell for women he couldn't have. He poured his longing into music instead of relationships. The piano sonatas, the string quartets, even the symphonies, all carried traces of this unfulfilled romantic yearning. Music became the substitute for everything else. By 1806, Ludwig was one of the most famous composers in Europe, despite being increasingly deaf. He could still hear some sounds if they were loud enough. He couldn't hear normal conversation. He couldn't hear the upper registers of the piano. He was composing masterpieces he could barely hear performed. The method was extraordinary. He would work at the piano feeling the vibrations through the instrument, hearing the music in his memory. He would write scores from pure imagination, knowing how the instruments would sound because he'd heard them thousands of times before. When he needed to verify something, he'd have musicians play it while he stood close enough to catch fragments. His sketchbooks from this period are chaotic, fragments of melody, crossed out passages, notes to himself. He would work on multiple compositions simultaneously, jumping between projects, revising endlessly. The process was messy, but the results were revolutionary. The Fifth Symphony, begun in 1804 and completed in 1808, opens with the most famous four notes in classical music. Da-da-da-dum. Ludwig supposedly described them as fate knocking at the door. Whether he actually said this or someone invented it later doesn't matter. The interpretation fits. The entire symphony is about struggle and triumph, darkness and light, fate and defiance. It's also astonishingly tight. Every theme grows from those four opening notes. The entire structure is organic, unified, inevitable. Ludwig was proving that music could be both emotionally overwhelming and intellectually rigorous. You could feel it in your gut and analyze it with your brain, both at once. The premiere concert in December 1808 was a marathon. It included the Fifth Symphony, the Sixth Symphony, the Fourth Piano Concerto, parts of the Mass in C, and a choral fantasy. Ludwig conducted. The theatre was freezing. The musicians were exhausted. The concert lasted over 4 hours. It was also one of the most important musical events of the century. Critics complained about the length. Audiences were stunned, but everyone recognized they'd witnessed something significant. Beethoven wasn't just a great composer, he was changing what music could be, what it could express, what it could do to a listener, and he was doing it while going deaf. By 1810, Ludwig could barely hear anything. He carried conversation books, notebooks where people would write what they wanted to say so he could read it and respond verbally. Hundreds of these books survive. They're heartbreaking. You can trace his increasing isolation through them. Friends writing jokes he couldn't hear. Musicians asking technical questions. Family members nagging him about money. His nephew Karl became an obsession. Caspar Karl, Ludwig's brother, died in 1815. His will named both his widow, Johanna, and Ludwig as guardians of 9-year-old Karl. Ludwig couldn't accept this. He despised Johanna, considered her immoral, unfit. He launched a legal battle to gain sole custody of the boy. It consumed him for years. Court battles, appeals, bitter arguments. Ludwig convinced himself he was rescuing Karl from a terrible mother. The reality was more complicated. Johanna loved her son. Ludwig's motives were a mixture of genuine concern and something darker, a need to control, to possess, to have something that was his. He won. In 1820, Ludwig gained full custody. It was a disaster. Karl didn't want to live with his uncle. He wanted his mother. Ludwig, deaf, temperamental, obsessed with his work, was completely unprepared to raise a teenager. He smothered the boy with attention, then ignored him for days while composing. He demanded gratitude, respect, obedience. Karl gave him none of it. The relationship deteriorated. Karl rebelled. Ludwig panicked. In 1826, Karl attempted suicide. He survived, but the message was clear. He couldn't live under his uncle's control anymore. Ludwig was shattered. The one person he'd tried to save had tried to escape him through death. It forced a reckoning. Maybe he didn't know what people needed. Maybe his deafness had isolated him, not just physically, but emotionally. Maybe he'd become impossible to live with. But the music kept coming. Even as his personal life collapsed, even as his hearing vanished completely, the compositions continued. They were changing. The middle period works, the symphonies 3 through 8, had been heroic, dramatic, public. The late works were something else, more internal, more searching, more strange. The late string quartets, composed between 1824 and 1826, are some of the most challenging pieces in the classical repertoire. They don't sound like anything else. They're not trying to please audiences or follow conventions. They're pure thought, pure emotion, translated directly into sound. Some movements are violent, others are transcendent. None of them are easy. Contemporary audiences didn't know what to make of them. Too difficult, too weird, too personal. It would take decades before musicians and listeners caught up to what Ludwig was doing. These pieces weren't entertainment. They were spiritual explorations, philosophical arguments, wrestling matches with mortality and meaning. The Ninth Symphony, premiered in 1824, was the capstone. Ludwig hadn't written a symphony in over a decade. When he finally returned to the form, he did something unprecedented. He added voices. The final movement sets Schiller's Ode to Joy for soloists, chorus and orchestra. It's a hymn to universal brotherhood, to the possibility of human connection, to joy itself. The premiere was chaotic. Ludwig insisted on conducting even though he was completely deaf. A second conductor actually directed the musicians while Ludwig stood on stage, waving his arms, hearing nothing. At the end, he was still conducting. Someone had to turn him around so he could see the audience applauding. He couldn't hear them. He wept. It was his last public appearance. He'd given them everything he had. The music that had sustained him through an impossible life. The music that had justified his existence. The music that proved deafness couldn't silence what mattered most. What he heard in his head. What he needed to say. What only he could express. The sound was gone. But the music was eternal. The years after the Ninth Symphony were quiet, not peaceful, just quiet. Ludwig retreated into his apartment, into his notebooks, into the strange private world that deafness had built around him. He was 54 years old and looked ancient. The thick dark hair had gone grey and wild. His face was lined and weathered. His clothes hung loose on a frame that had never been robust and was now shrunken. He walked bent forward, hands clasped behind his back, muttering to himself. People recognized him on the streets of Vienna, but kept their distance. There was something unapproachable about him, something fierce and broken at the same time. His living spaces were chaos, manuscripts piled on every surface, dirty dishes left for days, windows that hadn't been cleaned in months. He'd fire servants in fits of rage, then beg them to come back. Most didn't. The ones who stayed did so out of loyalty or pity, certainly not for the wages, which Ludwig often forgot to pay. He was composing, but differently now. The late string quartets had exhausted something in him. The Ninth Symphony had said what needed to be said about joy and brotherhood. What was left? He worked on smaller pieces, revisions of earlier works, sketches that went nowhere. There was talk of a 10th symphony, notes and fragments scattered through his papers, but it never coalesced. Maybe he knew there was nothing left to add to what the Ninth had accomplished. His health was failing in ways that went beyond deafness. His liver had been damaged by decades of heavy drinking. He suffered from jaundice, his skin taking on a yellowish cast. His stomach troubled him constantly. He had trouble breathing. Simple walks exhausted him. The body that had carried him through 50-some years of relentless creative output was finally giving up. Karl, his nephew, had recovered from the suicide attempt and joined the army. It was the one thing Ludwig had actually approved of. The military would give the boy structure, discipline, purpose. Or so Ludwig hoped. The truth was simpler. Karl wanted to be anywhere his uncle wasn't. The army offered an escape that even Ludwig couldn't argue against. Their parting was awkward. Ludwig wept. Karl was stiff, formal, eager to leave. He would visit occasionally over the next few months, but the relationship was permanently damaged. Ludwig had tried to be a father and failed completely. He'd smothered when he should have given space. He'd demanded when he should have listened. He'd been deaf to more than just sound. Winter came. 1826 turned to 1827. Ludwig caught a chill returning from a visit to Karl's garrison. The chill became something worse. He took to his bed in December and never really got up again. The doctors came. They tried everything. Bloodletting, which was still the preferred treatment for nearly every ailment. Herbal remedies, poultices, nothing helped. His abdomen swelled with fluid. They drained it multiple times, a painful procedure that provided temporary relief, but solved nothing. He knew he was dying. He'd known for months, probably longer. There was a strange acceptance about it. He'd fought his entire life, fought poverty, fought convention, fought his own body as it betrayed him sense by sense. He was tired. The fight was leaving him. Friends visited when they could. Anton Schindler, his secretary and self-appointed biographer, was there constantly, taking notes, preserving every detail for posterity. Some of those details were probably embellished later. Schindler wasn't above improving a good story, but the basic facts are reliable. Ludwig was lucid, almost to the end. He joked weekly with visitors. He worried about money, about unpaid bills, about the manuscripts scattered through his apartment. A publisher sent him a case of wine. Ludwig, bedridden and yellow with jaundice, managed to smile. Pity, pity, too late. Those were some of his last recorded words. Too late for the wine. Too late for the success that had come grudgingly. Too late for the life he might have had if circumstances had been different. On March 23rd, 1827, Vienna was hit by a sudden spring storm. Thunder cracked across the city. Lightning split the sky. Ludwig lay in bed, unconscious now, breathing in ragged gasps. Schindler and another friend kept watch. Around 5 in the afternoon, during a particularly loud thunderclap, Ludwig's eyes opened. He raised his right fist as if shaking it at the storm, at fate, at whatever force had made his life so difficult. Then his arm fell. The breathing stopped. Ludwig van Beethoven was dead at 56. The news spread through Vienna immediately. The musical community was shocked even though his decline had been public knowledge. He'd been part of the city's landscape for over 3 decades. Now he was gone. The funeral 3 days later drew an enormous crowd. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people lined the streets. Schools were closed. Businesses shut down. It was one of the largest public gatherings Vienna had ever seen. The procession wound through the city to the cemetery at Währing, just outside the city limits. Musicians walked alongside the coffin, composers, performers, students, admirers. Franz Schubert was there, one of the torchbearers. He was 30 years old and had never spoken to Ludwig directly. He'd been too intimidated to approach the great man. Now he helped carry him to his grave. The eulogy was written by Vienna's leading poet and delivered by an actor, since the poet himself was too overcome to speak. It praised Ludwig's genius, his dedication, his triumph over deafness. It was everything a funeral oration should be: noble, uplifting, slightly distant. The truth was messier. The man they buried had been difficult, often impossible. He'd alienated friends, tormented his family, and lived in squalor despite his fame. He'd been generous and petty, kind and cruel, visionary and blind. But the music, nobody questioned the music. The symphonies, the piano sonatas, the string quartets, the single opera that had taken him years to get right. All of it would outlive everyone present. The crowd knew it. That's why they came. Not to mourn a man they barely knew, but to honor the music that had changed their lives. What did Ludwig van Beethoven achieve? The question sounds simple until you try to answer it. He expanded the symphony from a pleasant entertainment into a philosophical statement. He transformed the piano sonata from a teaching exercise into high art. He showed that instrumental music could express ideas and emotions with a specificity that rivaled poetry. He proved that deafness was not a death sentence for a composer, that the inner ear could be more important than the outer one. But there's something else, something harder to quantify. He changed what people expected from music. Before Ludwig, composers were servants. They wrote what patrons requested. They followed established forms. They aimed to please. Ludwig wrote what he needed to write. He followed his own rules. He didn't care if audiences were confused or offended. The work came first, always. This sounds arrogant. It was arrogant, but it was also necessary. Someone had to break the old system. Someone had to show that music could be personal, difficult, challenging, that it didn't have to make you comfortable, that it could make you think, make you feel things you didn't want to feel, force you to confront questions you'd been avoiding. Every composer who came after him had to deal with his shadow. Brahms waited until he was 43 to publish his first symphony because he was terrified of being compared to Ludwig. Mahler built on the structures Ludwig had created. Schoenberg, pushing music into atonality decades later, saw himself as Ludwig's heir. The line runs straight through the 19th century and into the 20th. But influence isn't just about other composers, it's about what music became in the culture. Concert halls changed. Before Ludwig, musical performances were social events. People talked during concerts. They came and went. They treated the music as background. After Ludwig, silence became expected. The music demanded attention. The composer demanded respect. The idea of the struggling artist, the genius who suffers for his art, the tortured soul creating masterpieces from pain. Ludwig didn't invent this myth, but he embodied it perfectly. Every artist biography that followed borrowed from his story. The difficult childhood, the early talent, the physical limitations overcome through willpower. The final triumph, it became a template. His deafness was central to the legend. How could a deaf man write the Ninth Symphony? How could someone who couldn't hear create the most profound musical statements of the age? It seemed impossible. It was impossible. And yet the manuscripts exist. The performances continue. 2 centuries later, orchestras around the world still play what he wrote in silence. The conversation book survived too, over 400 of them. Visitors would write their questions and comments. Ludwig's spoken responses weren't recorded, since he was the one talking. But you can reconstruct the conversations from one side, fragments of his daily life preserved in handwriting. Someone asking about dinner plans, someone else inquiring about a new composition, Carl complaining about money, publishers negotiating terms. It's all there, scattered across thousands of pages. His manuscripts tell another story. The sketches show a mind that never stopped working. He'd draft a melody, cross it out, try again, write variations, discard them, return days later with a new approach. Nothing came easily. Every measure was fought for. The finished scores look clean, authoritative. The sketches reveal the struggle behind them. Modern scholarship has analysed the music in ways Ludwig never imagined. We can see patterns he probably wasn't conscious of. Motivic development across entire symphonies. Harmonic progressions that wouldn't become common until decades later. Structural innovations that changed how movements could be organised. He was inventing as he went, solving problems that no one else had encountered because no one else had tried to do what he was attempting. The Heiligenstadt Testament, that letter written to his brothers in 1802, was found among his papers after his death. He'd carried it for 25 years. Never sent it. Never threw it away. Just kept it. This record of his despair, his determination, his decision to keep living. When it was published, it shocked people. The great composer had considered suicide. He'd been that miserable, it made him human, vulnerable, real. The mythology built quickly. Within a generation, Ludwig had become Beethoven, the titan, the genius, the symbol of artistic integrity. The difficult personality was smoothed over. The poverty was romanticized. The deafness became noble suffering rather than daily torture. He was transformed from a complicated, often unpleasant human being into an icon. Some of that was inevitable. Distance does that. Time erases the small irritations and preserves the achievements. But some of it was deliberate. Schindler, his biographer, destroyed documents and fabricated stories to make Ludwig look better. Other early biographers did the same. The man disappeared behind the monument. Recent scholarship has tried to recover the real Ludwig, the one who smelled bad because he hated bathing, who fired servants over trivial offences, who cheated publishers and then complained about being cheated, who was generous to strangers and cruel to family, who could write the most sublime music imaginable and then throw a chair at someone who interrupted him. Both versions are true. The genius and the impossible man were the same person. You can't separate them. The personality that made him unbearable to live with was the same personality that wouldn't compromise on his artistic vision. The stubbornness that alienated friends was the stubbornness that produced the late quartets. The rage that drove people away fueled the music. His influence extended beyond concert halls. The Ninth Symphony's final movement, the Ode to Joy, became an anthem for human unity. The European Union adopted it as their official anthem. It's played at celebrations worldwide. It's been used to protest tyranny, to celebrate freedom, to mark historic moments. Schiller's words, set to Ludwig's music, have become a universal statement about human potential. But standing in a cemetery in Waring on that March day in 1827, nobody could see any of this. They saw a coffin being lowered into the ground. They heard the eulogies and the music. They remembered the difficult, brilliant man who'd lived among them. And then they went home. Life continued. Vienna moved on. The music didn't. It stayed, it spread. It grew in reputation and influence until Ludwig van Beethoven became simply Beethoven. One name, like Michelangelo or Shakespeare. A figure too large to be contained by biography. A legacy that transcended the man who created it. But what was actually in that music? What made it different? Why does it still matter 2 centuries later? Start with structure. Before Beethoven, symphonies followed predictable patterns. 4 movements, certain tempos, expected lengths. Composers coloured inside the lines. Ludwig redrew the lines. The Third Symphony, the Eroica, stretched a first movement to unprecedented length, not because he couldn't edit, but because the musical argument required that space to develop. The Ninth added a choir to a symphony. Nobody had done that. It wasn't supposed to work. Instrumental music was one thing, vocal music another. Mixing them seemed like category confusion, but Ludwig heard it complete in his mind and made everyone else hear it too. Consider harmony. Classical composers used dissonance carefully, resolving it quickly according to established rules. Ludwig used dissonance as a structural element. He'd pile up tensions, let them hang unresolved, make listeners uncomfortable until the eventual release felt like salvation. The opening of the First Symphony starts on a chord that's technically in the wrong key. 4 bars in, he still hasn't established the home key clearly. Contemporary audiences found it jarring. They were supposed to. Rhythm became architecture. That famous 4-note motif opening the Fifth Symphony. 3 short notes, 1 long. It appears in every movement, transformed, inverted, hidden in inner voices, but always there, obsessive, relentless. Unity through rhythmic cell development wasn't new, but Ludwig took it further than anyone had imagined possible. The entire symphony grows from those 4 notes like a tree from a seed. Then there's form itself. The sonata form that dominated classical music had clear sections: exposition, development, recapitulation. Ludwig exploded that framework from within. His developments became massive, turbulent sections that dwarfed the other parts. His recapitulations changed the material instead of simply repeating it. The Hammer-Clavier Sonata's first movement lasts 20 minutes. That's longer than entire sonatas by other composers, but every minute is necessary. Cut anything, and the structure collapses. Piano writing evolved under his hands, literally. The instruments of his youth couldn't handle what he was hearing. He demanded pianos with greater range, more power, better sustain. Manufacturers built them because Ludwig needed them. His late sonatas require instruments that didn't exist when he started composing. He was writing for the future, trusting that technology would catch up. String quartets became philosophical statements, the late quartets especially. 6 works composed in his final years, completely deaf, withdrawn from public life. They're strange, difficult pieces, long, slow movements that seem to exist outside time, fugues of mathematical complexity, sudden shifts between styles and moods. 19th century audiences didn't know what to make of them. Too advanced, critics said. The work of a deaf man who'd lost touch with musical reality. They were wrong. The late quartets weren't confused, they were prophetic. Composers a century later would mine them for techniques and insights. Bartók studied them obsessively. Shostakovich built on their foundation. They pointed toward modernism decades before modernism existed. Ludwig, isolated in silence, was hearing music that wouldn't make sense to anyone else for generations. But technique alone doesn't explain the impact. Plenty of composers mastercraft. Few achieve what Ludwig achieved. The difference is emotional truth. His music means something. Not in a programmatic way, not telling specific stories, but expressing fundamental human experiences. Struggle, joy, grief, triumph, terror, peace. The full range of what it feels like to be alive and conscious. The pastoral symphony evokes nature, yes, but it's not just sound painting. It's about humanity's relationship with the natural world, the relief of escaping the city, the spiritual renewal found in landscape, the terror of the storm, and the gratitude after it passes. You don't need to know anything about Ludwig's life to feel what the music communicates, or take the Missa Solemnis. Officially, it's a mass, sacred music for the Catholic Church. But Ludwig wasn't particularly religious in any orthodox sense. What he created was something else, a massive meditation on faith, doubt, and the human need for meaning. It's too long and too strange for regular church use. It was always meant for the concert hall, a spiritual statement in musical form. The theatrical works mostly failed during his lifetime. Fidelio, his only completed opera, went through multiple revisions and never achieved the popularity of Mozart's operas or the Italian works that dominated stages. But it survived because the music transcends the clunky plot. The hymn to freedom in the final act. The dungeon scene's claustrophobic terror. The sense of light breaking through darkness. These moments work on their own terms, regardless of the dramatic weaknesses surrounding them. Incidental music for plays, songs, choral works, even the occasional potboiler written for quick money. He composed constantly, in every genre available. Not all of it is equally inspired. Some of it is frankly mediocre. But even the lesser works show a mind thinking in sound, solving musical problems, pushing against limitations. His sketches reveal the process. Thousands of pages survived. He'd work through ideas obsessively, trying different versions, rejecting, refining, returning to earlier attempts. Nothing came easy. The music that sounds inevitable, that seems like it could be no other way, was fought for. Every bar represented choices made and alternatives discarded. Compare an early sketch of the Fifth Symphony's opening to the final version. The basic idea is there but softened, less stark. He sharpened it, made it harder, more confrontational. The gentle version might have been pretty. The final version is necessary, that's the difference. He kept working until he found necessity, the version that had to exist. Contemporary accounts describe him at the piano, improvising for hours, completely lost in sound, oblivious to listeners. The deafness didn't stop this. He could feel the vibrations. He knew the keyboard so well that his hands found the notes automatically. What he heard internally was more vivid than anything external ears could catch. Those improvisations are lost. No recordings, no transcriptions adequate to capture what happened. But people who heard them said nothing written came close to the spontaneous invention that poured out when he simply played. Teaching revealed another side. He was demanding, sometimes cruel, but the students who stuck with him learned. Carl Czerny, later famous for his piano exercises, studied with Ludwig as a boy. The lessons were irregular, often chaotic. Ludwig would criticize harshly, demonstrate brilliantly, then forget about the student for weeks. But Czerny absorbed something essential about musical thinking that he passed to his own students, including Liszt. The Archduke Trio, named for Rudolph, shows Ludwig at his most refined. 3 instruments, piano, violin and cello, conversing as equals, no showboating, just perfect balance and profound musical ideas developed with patience and craft. Its chamber music elevated to symphonic scope without losing intimacy. Rudolph premiered it despite limited technical abilities. The dedication was genuine affection, not just aristocratic patronage. Contradictions pile up the deeper you look. He championed Enlightenment ideals, but threw tantrums like a child. He set texts about universal brotherhood while nursing personal grudges for years. He revolutionized musical form while insisting he was following in Handel's and Bach's footsteps. He demanded absolute freedom as an artist, but composed on commission like any tradesman. The publishers drove him mad. Negotiations over fees, arguments about corrections, fights over unauthorized editions. He'd sell the same work to multiple publishers in different countries and then act offended when they accused him of double-dealing. The correspondence is exhausting. Page after page of complaints, demands, justifications. He needed the money, but resented needing it. Wanted to be treated as a great artist, but also wanted to extract maximum payment, like any shrewd businessman. His relationship with his nephew Carl became increasingly toxic through the 1820s. Ludwig couldn't let go, couldn't stop controlling, couldn't accept that Carl wasn't the idealized son figure he'd imagined. The attempted suicide in 1826 should have been a wake-up call. Instead, Ludwig blamed everyone else. The mother, the friends, society. Never his own suffocating obsession. Yet during these same years, he was composing the late quartets, experiencing daily misery in his personal life, while creating music of transcendent beauty. The contradiction isn't unusual for artists. Creation and dysfunction often coexist, but the gap between the chaos of his circumstances and the sublime order of the music remains striking. The conversation books offer glimpses into daily reality. People would write questions and comments. Ludwig would respond verbally or in writing. What survives is one side of thousands of conversations, mundane stuff mostly, dinner plans, gossip about other musicians, complaints about servants, the occasional profound thought buried in trivia. They're humanizing in a way the music isn't. This was someone who argued about grocery bills and worried about his digestion while simultaneously revolutionizing Western music. His political views were complicated. He genuinely believed in liberty and human rights. The dedication issues with the Eroica weren't just about Napoleon specifically, but about what Napoleon represented before becoming emperor. Ludwig wanted to believe in the possibility of enlightened leadership, rational government, the end of hereditary privilege. When reality disappointed, he didn't abandon the ideals. He just grew more pessimistic about their realization. The Congress system after Napoleon's defeat created a more repressive atmosphere in Vienna. Censorship increased. Police surveillance expanded. Liberal ideas became dangerous. Ludwig's music didn't become explicitly political, but certain works carried implications. The Ninth Symphony's finale, with its vision of universal brotherhood, had radical undertones in 1824. Not enough to get him arrested, he was too famous by then, but enough to make authorities nervous. Age brought physical deterioration beyond the deafness. His liver was failing, probably from years of alcohol consumption. His digestion was wrecked. He caught infections easily and recovered slowly. The final illness started in December 1826 and dragged on for months. Multiple doctors, various treatments, nothing helped. He knew he was dying, made arrangements, received visitors, tried to work but couldn't. The last quartet remained unfinished. Those final weeks propped up in bed, surrounded by sketches and manuscripts, he was still thinking in music. Friends reported him conducting invisible orchestras, his hands moving through the air. Whether he was hearing something internally or just habit, the gesture remained. Music was so fundamental to his existence that even approaching death didn't stop the impulse. The funeral drew 20,000 people. Not all of them were music lovers. Some came out of curiosity. Some wanted to say they were there, but many came because the music mattered to them personally. In an age before recordings, before radio, before easy access to concerts, Beethoven had still reached people. His works were performed, discussed, analysed, argued over. He'd become part of Viennese cultural identity. Schubert was their pallbearer. He'd met Ludwig only once, briefly, worshipped him from a distance, would die himself the following year, the torch passing to a new generation that would build on what Ludwig had achieved. The myth began immediately. Within days, the difficult aspects of his personality were being minimised. The nobility lie was repeated as fact. The poverty was exaggerated for dramatic effect. He became a symbol rather than a person. The Romantic movement, gaining strength across Europe, needed heroes. Dead artists were safer than living ones. They couldn't contradict the stories told about them. But underneath the mythology, the music remained. Complex, demanding, revelatory. It didn't need embellishment or false narratives. The notes on the page were radical enough. The legacy question is thornier than it seems. Not what Ludwig meant to music, that's obvious, but what he means now. Every generation reshapes him. The Romantics made him a tortured genius, battling fate. The Modernists emphasized the structural innovations. The 20th century focused on the psychological dimensions. The 21st still hasn't figured him out. Part of the problem is accessibility versus depth. The famous bits, the opening of the Fifth, the Ode to Joy, they've been used so much they've become cultural wallpaper. Commercials, movies, political rallies, everyone appropriates them. The music gets flattened into signifiers: triumph, brotherhood, overcoming adversity, generic inspiration detached from specific meaning. Dig deeper though, and the works resist easy interpretation. The late quartets especially. They're not about anything you can articulate cleanly. They exist in their own sonic universe, with internal logic that doesn't map onto narrative or emotion in straightforward ways. Listeners approach them like puzzles or religious experiences depending on temperament. Both reactions miss something. The influence question matters more than the legacy question. Who did Ludwig actually affect, and how? The immediate impact was enormous. Every composer working in German-speaking Europe had to deal with him. Some tried to continue his path. Others deliberately moved away. Nobody could ignore him. Schubert's case is instructive. He worked in Vienna simultaneously with Ludwig, but in completely different circles. Lower social tier, less ambitious works, shorter forms. Yet Schubert's harmonic language, his structural approaches, they're unthinkable without Ludwig's example. The influence operated indirectly, through absorbed principles rather than direct imitation. Mendelssohn worshipped Ludwig, but wrote music that sounds nothing like his. Lighter, more classical in proportion, less interested in struggle and triumph. Still, the seriousness of purpose, the craftsmanship standards, those came from Ludwig's model. You could reject his aesthetic while accepting his professional ethics. Schumann internalized the psychological intensity without the formal rigor. His works are more fragmentary, more dependent on extra-musical associations. But the idea that instrumental music could express complex emotional states, that came from Ludwig. The Romantics took that ball and ran with it, often in directions Ludwig would have hated. Wagner represents the problematic heir. He revered Ludwig publicly, while privately considering himself the superior artist, took the symphony's expansion of orchestral resources and applied it to opera, took the sense of historical mission and inflated it to messianic proportions, took the difficult personality and weaponized it. The worst aspects of Ludwig's legacy flow through Wagner to later generations. Brahms offers the counterexample. He understood Ludwig's classicism, the way innovation worked within established forms rather than exploding them. Brahms wrote symphonies that engage Ludwig's achievements without trying to one-up them. Respectful dialogue rather than anxious competition. Not coincidentally, Brahms's music has aged better than that of many flashier contemporaries. The Viennese modernists, Schoenberg and his students, claimed Ludwig as ancestor. They pointed to the late works, the increasing chromaticism, the loosening of tonal centers, argued that serialism was the logical next step. This required ignoring vast portions of Ludwig's output and intent, but revisionist history serves present needs. Every movement needs founding fathers. Performance practice evolved dramatically. The 19th century played Ludwig with massive forces, slow tempos, heavy expressiveness. Early 20th century pulled back toward leaner sounds. Period instrument movement pushed further, attempting to recreate conditions of original performances. Each approach reveals different aspects. None is definitive. Recordings changed everything. Before 1900, hearing Ludwig required attending concerts or playing piano transcriptions. Both filtered the music through contemporary taste and technical limitations. Recordings fixed performances in time, allowed comparison, democratized access, also created canonical interpretations that constrained later musicians. The Furtwängler Ninth, the Schnabel sonatas, they cast long shadows. The deafness narrative proved impossible to escape. It's too perfect dramatically. Composer who can't hear writing transcendent music. The reality was messier. He could hear somewhat through the 1810s, used ear trumpets, conversation books, physical contact with instruments. The isolation was social as much as auditory, but the clean story, genius triumphing over disability, that's what stuck. Modern scholarship tries to complicate the picture, examines the sketches, traces his working methods, analyzes his financial dealings, reveals a more calculating artist than the romantic myth suggested. Ludwig planned his career carefully, understood market forces, manipulated patrons and publishers. This doesn't diminish the achievement. If anything, it makes the music more impressive. He wasn't divinely inspired, he worked. The conversation books are treasure troves. One-sided dialogues where we see Ludwig's friends and associates writing questions, comments, gossip. His responses are lost. He spoke them, but context often makes them clear. They show daily life, arguments about money, discussions of politics, musical shop talk, complaints about servants, health concerns, the mundane texture of existence. Some entries are heartbreaking. Friends trying to discuss the deafness directly, Ludwig deflecting. Questions about his nephew's behaviour, Ludwig defensive. Attempts to arrange social gatherings, Ludwig agreeing then cancelling. You see the loneliness accumulating, people trying to maintain connection with someone increasingly difficult to reach. The nephew situation deserves its own examination. Karl was Ludwig's brother Caspar's son. When Caspar died in 1815, Ludwig fought for custody against the boy's mother Johanna. The legal battle dragged on for years. Ludwig won eventually, but the relationship was poisoned from the start. He had no idea how to parent, oscillated between smothering attention and harsh criticism. Karl attempted suicide in 1826, survived, joined the army, outlived his uncle by decades. Modern readers see warning signs throughout. Ludwig's obsessive need for control, his inability to accept Karl as a separate person with his own needs, the projection of unfulfilled ambitions onto a confused teenager. But 19th century aristocratic parenting wasn't gentle generally. Ludwig's failures were extreme versions of common patterns. Doesn't excuse them, does contextualize. The household staff situation was chronically unstable. Servants never lasted long. Ludwig accused them of theft, incompetence, conspiracy. Some accusations were justified. Vienna's servant class included plenty of opportunists, but the constant turnover suggests the problem wasn't entirely external. Living with Ludwig must have been impossible. The deafness meant shouting. The work habits meant irregular schedules. The temper meant unpredictable explosions. Money remained complicated until the end. He earned substantial sums but managed them poorly, kept cash in desk drawers and forgot about it, suspected banks of fraud, made impulsive purchases, then regretted them. His estate was worth more than expected when finally inventoried. He'd been hoarding. The nephew inherited everything. Whether that was blessing or curse depends on your perspective. The final months were gruesome. Abdominal swelling required 4 surgeries to drain fluid. Contemporary medical practice involved literally puncturing the abdomen. No anesthesia beyond alcohol. Each procedure brought temporary relief, followed by renewed accumulation. He was drowning from the inside. Liver failure, kidney failure, systems shutting down sequentially. Friends visited when they could, some genuine, some morbidly curious. He received them propped in bed, surrounded by manuscripts, still trying to work between bouts of pain. The last quartet movements remained incomplete. Sketches existed, but the full realization never happened. We'll never know what he intended. The fragments suggest something even more radical than the previous late works. Death interrupted the trajectory before its conclusion. The story about him raising his fist toward heaven during a thunderstorm on his deathbed is probably apocryphal. The only witness reported it decades later, and the details shifted in retelling. But it fit the romantic narrative, so it stuck. Ludwig battling God himself in his final moments. More likely, he died like most people, gradually, uncomfortably, surrounded by well-meaning incompetence. His last words supposedly were, "Pity, pity, too late," upon receiving a gift of wine. Again, single source reported later, questionable reliability, but even if false, it captures something. The sense of unfinished business, the feeling that time ran out too soon. He was 56, not young but not old. He could have had another decade. What would have come next? The speculation is pointless but irresistible. Would the late style have continued evolving? Would he have circled back toward earlier approaches? Would he have composed opera, oratorio, works in forms he'd avoided? Or would declining health have ended productivity years before death? We construct fantasies from silence. The funeral procession wound through Vienna's streets. Schools closed, businesses shut down. Military units lined the route. The crowd was enormous, estimates vary wildly, but clearly unprecedented for a musician. Schubert carrying the torch. Grillparz's funeral oration, read by an actor because the poet was too overcome. Burial in Waring Cemetery, later moved to the Central Cemetery, alongside other Viennese cultural heroes. The monument building began immediately. Not physical monuments initially, though those came later, but the construction of Beethoven as symbol. The Romantic movement needed its martyr. The German national movement needed its genius. The music education establishment needed its paragon. Each constituency shaped Ludwig to their requirements. The First World War demonstrated how completely he'd been absorbed into nationalist rhetoric. Both sides claimed him. The Germans, obviously, he was theirs. But the Allies too, emphasising the universal humanism, the freedom themes. Music that was supposed to transcend politics became its vehicle. The Ninth Symphony played in contexts Ludwig never imagined, some glorious, some horrific. The Nazis were inevitable. They appropriated everything culturally significant. The Ninth at party rallies, recordings distributed to troops, Fidelio's freedom celebration reinterpreted as Aryan triumph. The music survived this, barely. Post-war performances carried baggage. Japanese orchestras, playing the Ninth every New Year's Eve, helped rehabilitate it. The European Union, adopting the Ode to Joy as anthem, completed the reclamation. Meaning is unstable. Cold War dynamics added another layer. East Germany claimed Ludwig as proto-socialist. His struggles against aristocratic patrons, his identification with common people, his brother's actual socialist sympathies, all pressed into service. West Germany countered with emphasis on individual genius, artistic freedom, universal rather than class values. Same music, opposite interpretations. The avant-garde had complicated relationships with Ludwig. Boulez famously wanted to blow up the opera houses, burn the tradition, start over. Yet even the serialists couldn't fully escape. The late quartets kept intruding. Their radical fragmentation, their refusal of easy resolution, spoke to modernist sensibilities despite their tonal language. You could reject Beethoven generally while making exceptions for specific works. Minimalists reacted against the whole Germanic tradition, rejected development, complexity, emotional heaviness. Philip Glass's music sounds nothing like Ludwig's, yet both composers share obsessive repetition, hypnotic accumulation, building to cathartic release. The techniques differ completely, but certain underlying impulses align. Influence operates in mysterious ways. Popular music's relationship is mostly ignorance. Classical music generally, and Ludwig specifically, exist in different universes, from rock, pop, hip-hop. Occasional samples, usually the most famous bits, orchestral backing on ballads. But genuine engagement is rare. The stylistic gap is too wide. The cultural contexts don't overlap. This represents failure by both traditions. Ludwig's music should be more accessible. Popular music should be more curious. The movie soundtracks keep him alive for general audiences. Not his actual music usually, though some films use it, but the emotional templates he established, the association of certain orchestral textures with specific feelings, that's pure Ludwig. Every Hollywood crescendo owes him, every triumphant finale, every moment of manufactured transcendence. Film composers are his children, whether they know it or not. The piano remains central to his popular image. Every conservatory student works through the sonatas. Every competition includes them. The technical challenges, the interpretive demands, they're still relevant pedagogically. But also, the music itself continues revealing new dimensions. Performers keep finding things previous generations missed. The scores are inexhaustible. The string quartets occupy stranger territory. Too difficult for amateurs, too demanding for casual listening. They exist in a specialized realm, revered by cognoscenti, unknown to wider audiences, yet they represent Ludwig's most radical achievements. The late works especially push the medium further than anyone before or since. They're not user-friendly. They're not supposed to be. The last decade arrived with complications. 1816 brought Karl's custody battle to crisis. The nephew was 15, rebellious, caught between his mother and uncle. Ludwig won legal guardianship, but lost any chance of normal relationship. Karl resented the control, the expectations, the constant surveillance. Who wouldn't? Being nephew to genius doesn't compensate for having no freedom. The mother, Johanna, kept fighting. Courts reversed decisions, then reversed reversals. Ludwig's deafness became legal issue. How can deaf man raise teenage boy? Valid question, terrible answer. The litigation dragged through 1818, 1819, into 1820. Ludwig's letters from this period reveal desperation. He'd won the greatest musical battles imaginable, but couldn't manage one troubled teenager. Karl wasn't bad kid, just normal one, trapped in impossible situation. His uncle demanded perfection, monitored everything, interpreted every mistake as moral failure. The boy attended various schools, none satisfactory. He showed musical talent. His uncle pushed too hard. He showed interest in commerce. His uncle deemed it beneath family dignity. No path was acceptable. 1826 brought the catastrophe everyone saw coming. Karl attempted suicide, shot himself in the head. Survived? Barely. The bullet grazed skull instead of penetrating. He recovered physically. The emotional damage was permanent for both. Ludwig was shattered. His entire project of redemption through guardianship had produced this outcome. The final reconciliation happened in hospital. They found some peace, some mutual understanding. Too late, obviously, but better than nothing. Karl eventually joined the military, got away from Vienna, made decent life, survived his uncle by decades. But those years of struggle had cost both of them dearly. The music from this period shows nothing of these troubles, or everything, depending how you listen. The late quartets emerged while Karl crisis unfolded. They're not about Karl specifically, but they're saturated with experience of isolation, struggle, attempted transcendence. You can't separate biography from work completely. The Ninth Symphony's premiere happened in 1824 amid the custody battles. May 7th, Theater am Kärntnertortheater. Ludwig conducted, or tried to. He stood at the podium making gestures, while actual conductor kept orchestra together. The audience went wild. Ludwig couldn't hear the applause, didn't know the ovation was happening, until Singer turned him around to see it. That image is almost too perfect. The deaf composer, at his greatest triumph, unable to perceive the response, facing away from the audience at the moment of vindication. Someone should paint it. Someone probably did. The reception was complicated though. The symphony baffled many. Too long, too strange, too difficult. The choral finale seemed bolted on. What was vocal music doing in symphony anyway? The text from Schiller's Ode to Joy was embarrassingly earnest. Brotherhood of man, millions embracing, kiss for the whole world. Who talks like that? Yet something undeniable was happening. The piece was monumental in ways audiences couldn't process immediately. It required the romantic movement to fully ripen before people understood what Ludwig had done. He'd exploded the symphony from within, expanded it beyond recognition, then somehow held it together through sheer compositional will. The vocal entrance was revolutionary. 40 minutes of instrumental music, then human voice cuts through. O Freunde, nicht diese Töne. Oh friends, not these tones. The baritone rejects everything that came before, demands something new. Joy instead of struggle, unity instead of conflict. It's theatrical, it's unprecedented, it's totally Ludwig. The melody itself is simple almost to point of banality, but that's the genius. A tune anyone can remember, varied endlessly, built into something transcendent. The fugal sections are complex, the orchestration is radical, but the core melody remains accessible. High art meeting popular sensibility. The premiere wasn't financial success. Receipts were disappointing, but the cultural impact was immediate. This was event, not just concert. People who weren't there heard about it, talked about it, formed opinions. The ninth entered conversation, became reference point. Future composers had to deal with it. The late quartet's a different story. No public premieres, no dramatic receptions. They were written for string quartet, premiered in small venues, understood by almost no one. The quartet in C-sharp minor, Opus 131, has 7 movements played without pause. The opening fugue is slow, mysterious, questioning. Nothing like this existed before. The Grossi fugue, originally the finale of Opus 130, was too much even for supporters. Publisher convinced Ludwig to write alternate ending, which he did, but the fugue got published separately, and that's the version that matters. 15 minutes of unrelenting contrapuntal intensity. Dissonant, violent, exhausting. Modernist music before modernism existed. These late works confused everyone. Too dense, too difficult, too strange. Some suggested Ludwig's deafness had made him lose touch with actual sound. He was writing for deaf ears, they said. Music that looked good on paper, but didn't work in performance. This criticism was completely wrong, but took decades to disprove. The problem was audiences' ears, not Ludwig's writing. The pieces require different listening mode. You can't approach them expecting classical balance or romantic sweep. They operate according to their own logic, create their own worlds. Each late quartet is a unique universe with specific gravity and atmosphere. The quartet in a minor, opus 132, includes movement titled Holy Song of Thanksgiving to the Divinity from a Convalescent in the Lydian mode. Ludwig had been seriously ill, recovered, and wrote this music as response. It's extraordinary. Ancient church mode alternating with modern sections. Slow, rapturous, building to quiet intensity rather than loud climax. This isn't program music exactly. It's not depicting illness and recovery narratively, but it's infused with that experience, transformed into pure musical expression. The gratitude is palpable but abstract. You feel it without needing the title. The final works show Ludwig pushing boundaries nobody else saw. The Diabelli variations, 33 variations on mediocre waltz theme, turn trivial material into profound meditation. Over an hour of music wrung from 8-bar melody. Some variations are jokes, some are sublime, all are inventive. Its universe in grain of sand. The Missa Solemnis, the Great Mass in D, took years to complete. Ludwig studied church music, ancient counterpoint, Palestrina and Bach. He wanted to write Mass that was both liturgically correct and personally meaningful. The result is overwhelming. Over an hour of densely worked choral and orchestral music. Powerful, but not comfortable. This isn't pretty church music. It's wrestling with the divine. The premiere happened in St. Petersburg, of all places. Russian prince commissioned performance. Vienna heard it later, in pieces, in concert settings rather than church. It was too difficult for liturgical use anyway. Still is. Churches rarely perform it complete. It's more oratorio than mass, more concert work than worship music. These late works share quality of timelessness, not in sense of being old-fashioned, but of existing outside time. They don't sound like products of 1820s. They don't sound like anything. Each creates its own temporal space. You enter the music and regular time stops applying. The creative process was slower now. Ludwig's health was failing. Liver disease, probably cirrhosis. Years of drinking hadn't helped. The deafness was total. Communication happened through conversation books, visitors writing questions and comments. His responses were usually verbal, so we have one-sided dialogues. Strange archive. The notebooks show obsessive revision. Ideas worked and reworked. Sketches for movements that might never be used. Fragments that could go anywhere or nowhere. The composing had always been laborious, but now it was agonizing. Every bar cost something. Money remained problem. Publishers were less interested in difficult late works. The market wanted accessible music, light opera, popular songs. Ludwig's output was increasingly specialized. Only connoisseurs wanted it. That small market. He lived on loans, gifts, promises of commissions, not destitute, but always anxious about finances. The apartments kept changing. Landlords tired of deaf tenants who paid late, made noise, kept irregular hours. He moved constantly around Vienna, never settling, never comfortable. The residences grew shabbier. The great composer who dined with princes lived in modest rooms with broken furniture. His appearance deteriorated. Always careless about grooming, he became genuinely unkempt. clothing worn and stained, hair wild, behaviour erratic. People who met him late in life were often shocked. This was Beethoven? This dishevelled man shouting because he couldn't hear his own voice? Yes, still him, still capable of miracles on paper, even while falling apart physically. The friendships that sustained him were fewer. Many old friends had died or drifted away. The immortal beloved, whoever she was long gone. Karl provided connection, but not warmth. Some younger musicians showed devotion. Franz Schubert worshipped from distance but barely knew him. Anton Schindler became secretary, companion, eventual biographer. Schindler's biography is problematic, full of inventions and distortions, but he was there. The final illness began in December 1826. Ludwig caught cold travelling back from visit to Karl's regiment. The cold worsened. Then liver problems intensified. Doctors were called, treatments applied, nothing helped. Dropsy, they said. Fluid accumulating, 4 operations to drain the fluid. Temporary relief, then worse again. The sick room was chaos. Visitors coming and going, doctors arguing, Schindler managing things badly, Ludwig drifting in and out of consciousness. Some days he could write letters, other days he couldn't recognise people. The decline was slow and undignified. Gifts arrived from London Philharmonic Society, money for medical expenses, cases of wine. Ludwig was touched. He'd never visited London despite invitations. The English admired him more than the Viennese did by this point. That money and wine mattered, not much but something. The final rally came March 24th. Ludwig seemed to improve. Doctors were cautiously optimistic. He talked about future projects. Then he collapsed. The last days were difficult. He was unconscious most of the time. When he woke, he was confused, agitated. March 26th brought the famous storm. Thunder and lightning over Vienna. In the afternoon, around 5:30, Ludwig was lying in bed. Schindler and another friend were present. Thunder crashed, lightning flashed. Ludwig's eyes opened suddenly. He raised his right fist, shaking it toward the window, toward the storm. Then he fell back. Dead. That's the story anyway. Schindler told it. It's probably embellished. Deathbed scenes always are, but it fits. Ludwig raging at the heavens one last time. Defiant to the end. Whether it happened exactly that way doesn't matter. It should have. The funeral was enormous. 20,000 people in the streets. Schools closed, businesses shut. The entire city acknowledged the loss. He'd been difficult, prickly, sometimes impossible. But Vienna knew what it had lost. The greatest composer of the age. Maybe the greatest composer ever. That was already understood. The burial was at Währing Cemetery. Franz Grillparzer wrote the funeral oration, though actor spoke it because Grillparzer was too overcome. The text praised Ludwig's genius, his struggle, his triumph. It was eloquent and true. The crowd was silent. Even Vienna, which had often treated him badly, recognised the moment's weight. The estate was messy. Debts, unpaid bills, shares in music that might generate income eventually. Karl inherited most of it. Not much to inherit, really. Some furniture, some manuscripts, conversation books. The legacy was the music, not property. The conversation books were fascinating and terrible. Thousands of pages of one-sided dialogue, questions written, responses lost. Later editors destroyed many, considering them too trivial or embarrassing. Schindler probably burned others. What remains is fragment of fragment, enough to glimpse the isolation, the struggle to communicate, the endless practical difficulties deafness created. The manuscripts scattered. Some stayed with publishers, some were sold, some were given away. No systematic archive existed. Decades later, scholars tried reconstructing chronology, identifying authentic works versus spurious attributions. The process continues. We're still learning things about the compositional process. The immediate posthumous reputation was complicated. The late works remained puzzling. The middle period works, the heroic symphonies and concertos, those were the ones people celebrated. The ninth was controversial, but acknowledged as important. The late quartets were respected but rarely performed. Reputation shifts over time. It took decades for people to really understand the late quartets. The Grosse Fuge was initially rejected as unplayable nonsense. Publishers substituted a simpler finale. By the 20th century, musicians recognized the Fuge as perhaps the greatest piece Ludwig ever wrote. Stravinsky called it contemporary forever. That's what happened with much of the late work. It aged forward, not backward. Each generation found new meanings in it. The Romantics claimed Ludwig as their prophet. Berlioz, Liszt, Wagner all saw themselves continuing what he'd started. The programmatic elements in the Pastoral Symphony, the vocal finale of the ninth, these gave permission for music to expand beyond absolute form. Wagner especially built his entire philosophy partly on misreading Ludwig. The idea that Beethoven had reached music's limits, and only music drama could advance further. That's nonsense, but Wagner believed it, and it shaped an era. Brahms represented the opposite camp. Conservative Beethovenians who believed in absolute music, in structure and logic. Brahms waited until his 40s to publish a symphony because Ludwig's shadow was too intimidating. When he finally did, people called it Beethoven's 10th. Not entirely fair, but understandable. Those two poles, Wagner and Brahms, defined musical politics for decades. Both claimed Ludwig as ancestor. Both were partly right. The Beethoven myth grew enormous during the 19th century. He became the suffering artist, the isolated genius, the heroic creator battling fate. Biographers emphasized the deafness, the struggles, the triumph of will. They downplayed the humor, the everyday concerns, the contradictions. The myth was useful, but limiting. It made Ludwig into a monument, rather than a person. The 20th century had to rediscover the man behind the myth. Scholars started reading the conversation books, the letters, the contemporary accounts. A more complex picture emerged. Saint the heroic titan, but also the difficult neighbour, the anxious uncle, the man who made jokes and worried about money. Both versions are true. He was extraordinary and ordinary simultaneously. That's actually more interesting than pure myth. The music itself kept revealing new dimensions. Early 20th century modernists found validation in the late works. Schoenberg wrote about Ludwig's innovations, the way he dissolved traditional forms from within. The late quartets especially seemed to predict atonality, serialism, all the developments that came later. That's overstated, but there's truth in it. Ludwig was pushing boundaries in ways that took generations to fully comprehend. The political appropriations were inevitable and unfortunate. The Nazis claimed Ludwig as supreme German genius. They played the ninth at party rallies, used his image for propaganda, completely missed the point of the Ode to Joy, which celebrates universal brotherhood. After World War II, Furtwängler and others had to rehabilitate the music from that association. The ninth became controversial in some circles. Did performing it mean accepting nationalist interpreter? Tie-ins? Eventually, people recognized that music can't be owned by ideology. The Ode to Joy became the European Union anthem. Same music, opposite meaning? That's the thing about great art. It survives its interpreters. The pianists and conductors who shaped Ludwig's reception formed their own tradition. Liszt championed the late sonatas when they were considered unplayable. Bülow performed all the sonatas in recital cycles, establishing them as canonical. Schnabel made the first complete recording in the 1930s. Each generation of performers discovers something new. Historically informed performance changed everything, again starting in the 60s and 70s. People started questioning the Romantic performance tradition. What did Ludwig actually want? How did his piano sound? What were performance conventions in Vienna around 1800? This opened up the music in unexpected ways, lighter, faster, more rhythmically vital. Not better necessarily, but different. It reminded people that Ludwig wasn't a Victorian, he was a classicist pushing toward Romanticism. The recordings accumulated into an overwhelming archive. Every symphony recorded hundreds of times. Every sonata, every quartet. You could spend a lifetime just listening to different interpretations of the ninth. That abundance is wonderful and paralyzing. How do you hear the music fresh when you've heard 50 versions? Yet musicians keep returning to it. Every conductor wants to record the symphonies. Every pianist tackles the sonatas eventually. There's always something new to say, some insight to reveal. The influence on later composers is impossible to fully trace. Everyone after Ludwig had to reckon with him somehow. Either continue his path or deliberately reject it. Schubert lived in his shadow and died trying to escape it. Mahler saw himself as Ludwig's successor, writing symphonies that expanded the form even further. Shostakovich quoted Ludwig constantly, especially in his late quartets. Jazz musicians found inspiration in Ludwig's rhythmic innovations, his improvisatory development techniques. Rock musicians absorbed the structural ambition, the dynamic contrasts. You can hear echoes in everything from the Beatles to Radiohead. The cultural weight became so massive that some composers had to actively resist. The Second Viennese School tried moving beyond tonality, partly because Ludwig had exhausted its possibilities. Cage and the avant-garde rejected the whole tradition of genius and masterwork. Yet even in rejection, they were responding to Ludwig. You can't escape that influence. It's like gravity. The biographical industry never stopped. Books appeared constantly, each claiming new insights. Some were scholarly and careful. Others were sensationalist, inventing romances and conspiracies. The immortal beloved controversy generated hundreds of pages of speculation. Who was she? Why did Ludwig never send the letter? Theories multiplied, none conclusive. It became a cottage industry for musicologists. Probably we'll never know for certain. Maybe that's fine. Some mysteries should stay mysterious. The conversation books raised ethical questions. Should scholars publish them complete, including the trivial and embarrassing, or edit for dignity? Early editors chose dignity, destroying material they considered unworthy. Later scholars wanted everything preserved, arguing that completeness matters more than image protection. The tension remains. How much privacy does a dead genius deserve? The manuscripts became objects of obsession. Collectors paid fortunes for sketches. Libraries competed for holdings. The British Library, the Berlin State Library, the Beethoven House in Bonn all have major collections. Scholars make pilgrimages to study them, searching for clues about compositional process. The sketches reveal how Ludwig worked, how pieces evolved through dozens of revisions. Nothing came easy. Every measure was fought for. That's somehow reassuring. Genius is work, not magic. The Ninth Symphony's performance history deserves its own book. The premiere in 1824 was chaotic but triumphant. Subsequent performances were controversial. Wagner rewrote parts he considered unplayable. Mahler made his own revisions. Only gradually did people accept that Ludwig knew what he was doing. The famous story about the tempo of the last movement, whether the metronome marking is a mistake, that debate continues. Toscanini took it fast. Furtwängler took it slow. Both were convincing. Maybe there's no single correct answer. The Ode to Joy took on political significance Ludwig never intended. It was sung at the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's performed at New Year's in Japan. It accompanies state occasions worldwide. Leonard Bernstein conducted it in Berlin after reunification, changing Freud to Freiheit, joy to freedom. Moving but controversial. Should you alter a composer's text for political purposes? The late quartets remained the inner sanctum. Casual listeners might know the symphonies, the Fifth's opening, the Ninth's finale. But the late quartets required something more: patience, concentration, willingness to enter a private world. They weren't entertainment exactly. They were communion. Performers approached them with reverence bordering on fear. The Grosse Fuge especially intimidated people. It's relentless, uncompromising, almost aggressive in its demands. Yet once you enter that world, once you accept its terms, it's overwhelming. Some musicians say performing it is like wrestling with something larger than yourself. The influence on string quartet repertoire was total. Every composer who wrote quartets afterward had to contend with Ludwig's late works. They set a standard that was simultaneously inspiring and crushing. How do you follow the last quartets? Schubert died trying. Brahms took decades working up courage. Bartók and Shostakovich found their own paths but never escaped the shadow. The piano sonatas formed another complete universe. 32 sonatas spanning Ludwig's entire career. From the early works still rooted in Haydn and Mozart, through the middle period heroic style, to the late transcendent pieces. Every pianist's journey involves climbing that mountain. The last three sonatas especially, Opus 109, 110 and 111, they exist in their own realm. Quiet, introspective, occasionally erupting into violence, then returning to stillness. They don't resolve in traditional ways, they dissolve. The concertos entered the permanent repertoire immediately. Every pianist played the fourth and fifth. The violin concerto became a rite of passage. The triple concerto remained an oddity, beautiful but awkward to program. The piano concertos especially defined the genre. Nobody after Ludwig could write a piano concerto without acknowledging his achievement. The expansion of the form, the integration of soloist and orchestra, the dramatic possibilities, all of that became standard. Recordings in the 20th century brought Ludwig to audiences unimaginable in his lifetime. Suddenly everyone could hear the symphonies performed by the world's greatest orchestras. The Berlin Philharmonic under Furtwängler, the Vienna Philharmonic under Klemperer, the NBC Symphony under Toscanini. These became reference recordings, shaping how people heard the music. Then historically informed performance created alternative traditions. The Academy of Ancient Music, the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment, playing on period instruments. Suddenly the same symphonies sounded different. Lighter textures, faster tempos, sharper articulation. Both traditions coexist now. There's no single authentic Beethoven anymore. Maybe there never was. Film music absorbed Ludwig constantly. The Fifth's opening became shorthand for fate and destiny. The Pastoral appeared in countless scenes of natural beauty. The Ninth's finale accompanied everything from utopian visions to apocalyptic scenarios. Kubrick used it ironically in A Clockwork Orange, making the Ode to Joy soundtrack to violence. That disturbed people, but it proved the music's flexibility. It could mean whatever context demanded. The Beethoven anniversaries became cultural events. The 100th anniversary of his death in 1827, the 150th in 1977, the 250th birthday in 2020. Each generated festivals, new recordings, scholarly conferences. The music industry loved anniversaries. They justified complete edition reissues, box sets, commemorative performances. But beyond commercialism, people genuinely wanted to mark these moments. Ludwig mattered in a way few composers did. His music felt essential, not just beautiful. The sketches revealed a man who never settled. He revised constantly, trying versions, discarding them, starting over. The manuscripti. Dies are covered with crossings out, marginal notes, second thoughts. Nothing came easily. That's the real lesson. Genius is persistence, not inspiration. The myth of the suffering artist who channels divine music directly from the heavens, that's romantic nonsense. Ludwig worked harder than almost anyone. He earned his achievements through relentless effort. The conversation books showed a different side. The everyday concerns, the arguments about money, the complaints about servants. One book records Ludwig arguing with someone about the price of fish. Another has him discussing whether to change laundries. These mundane details humanize him. The Titan worried about fish prices. The deaf composer still cared about clean shirts. That's somehow moving. The political legacy remained complicated. Revolutionary movements claimed Ludwig as their composer. The Ode to Joy became a protest song. Conservative governments also claimed him, celebrating German cultural achievement. He was too big, too universal to belong to any single ideology. That universality was the point. The music transcended its origins. A deaf man in Vienna wrote pieces that spoke to everyone everywhere. That's extraordinary when you think about it. The final works pointed towards something beyond music. The late quartets especially feel like they're reaching for an inexpressible truth. Not program music exactly, but music that gestures toward meanings beyond itself. Religious without being liturgical. Philosophical without being didactic. Just sound organized in ways that move people profoundly. How does that work? Nobody fully knows. Musicologists analyze the structures, identify the techniques, but analysis doesn't explain the effect. Why does the cavatina from Opus 130 make people weep? The notes are just notes. The intervals follow rules. Yet something happens in the listening that transcends the technical. That's the mystery. Ludwig's later years were marked by increasing isolation, though not the kind people imagine. He wasn't a hermit. He still went to taverns, still argued with his brother, still attended concerts when his health permitted. But deafness created a barrier nothing could fully bridge. Conversations happened through the conversation books. Someone would write a question or comment. Ludwig would respond aloud, his voice loud and unmodulated because he couldn't hear himself. Then the next written exchange. It was slow, exhausting, fundamentally limiting. Real conversation requires spontaneity, the quick back and forth that builds ideas collaboratively. That was gone. His nephew Karl became an obsession. Johann had died, leaving Karl orphaned. Ludwig fought his sister-in-law for custody, won legally, then discovered he had no idea how to raise a teenager. Karl was sullen, resentful, caught between his uncle's suffocating affection and his mother's competing influence. Ludwig tried controlling everything: Karl's education, his friends, his career path. It backfired spectacularly. In 1826, Karl attempted suicide, shot himself in the head, survived, fled Vienna to join the army. The guilt devastated Ludwig. His letters from this period are heartbreaking. A man who'd conquered musical form couldn't manage basic human relationships. The string quartet in C-sharp minor, Opus 131, emerged from this darkness. 7 movements instead of the usual 4. Strange tempos, stranger harmonies. The 4th movement is a lament, marked by Ludwig himself as a question. Must it be? The 5th movement answers. It must be. Life continues despite suffering. The resolution isn't triumphant exactly. It's acceptance. Mature, hard-won acceptance of what cannot be changed. That's the late Ludwig. Not defiance anymore, but understanding. Money remained a constant worry despite his fame. Publishers paid well for new works, but Ludwig spent carelessly, gave money to relatives, invested poorly. He'd negotiated a stipend from 3 aristocratic patrons back in 1809, but inflation had eroded its value. One patron died, another defaulted. The surviving payments barely covered expenses, so Ludwig kept working, kept composing, kept negotiating with publishers even as his body failed. The health problems accelerated after 1825. Liver disease, possibly cirrhosis, though the cause remains debated. Some blame his drinking. Others point to lead poisoning from the wine or the mineral waters he took medicinally. The symptoms were unmistakable: jaundice, swelling, terrible pain. He consulted multiple doctors. They tried various treatments, all useless. 18th century medicine couldn't help him. Yet the music kept coming. The string quartet in F major, Opus 135, was his last complete work. finished in October 1826. It's peaceful in a way the earlier quartets aren't. No struggle, no wrestling with fate, just beauty. The slow movement breathes like a prayer. Not a plea for help, more like a meditation. Someone at peace with what's coming. He started another quartet, left it unfinished. Sketches exist for a 10th symphony too. The ideas were still there. The body couldn't continue. By December 1826, Ludwig was bedridden. He rallied occasionally, received visitors, talked about future projects. But everyone knew. His doctor recorded the decline in clinical detail. The swelling worsened. They tried draining fluid 4 times, puncturing his abdomen. Primitive, painful, ultimately futile. Friends gathered. Schindler was there constantly, though his later accounts proved unreliable. He invented conversations, forged entries in the conversation books to make himself seem more important. Other visitors were more honest. Anselm Hüttenbrenner described Ludwig's final days without embellishment, the composer drifting in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes delirious, the room dark, the winter light weak through the windows. March 26th, 1827. Late afternoon. A thunderstorm rolled across Vienna. Lightning flashed. Thunder shook the building. According to Hüttenbrenner, who was present, Ludwig suddenly opened his eyes, raised his fist toward the storm, then fell back. Gone. It's probably myth. Hüttenbrenner told different versions over the years. Details changed, but the image stuck. Beethoven shaking his fist at heaven one last time, defiant to the end. Whether it happened or not, people wanted it to be true. It fit the narrative too perfectly to discard. The funeral 3 days later drew 20,000 people, the largest public funeral Vienna had seen. Schools closed, the military sent honor guards. 8 Kapellmeisters carried the coffin. Schubert was a torchbearer, though he'd barely known Ludwig personally. The procession wound through the streets for hours. People lined the route, crowded windows, climbed on roofs. They were mourning more than a composer. They were mourning an era. The autopsy revealed extensive liver damage, also damage to the auditory nerves, confirming what everyone already knew. The hearing loss was permanent, organic, irreversible. No treatment could have helped. The doctors who'd promised cures had been charlatans or optimists. Ludwig had been deaf, would have remained deaf, end of story. His estate was modest. Some furniture, some manuscripts, some shares in a bank that became the inheritance for nephew Karl. Not wealth exactly, but security. Karl took the money, lived quietly, eventually had children. None showed musical talent. The Beethoven line ended musically with Ludwig. The manuscripts became treasures. Collectors paid enormous sums for original scores. The sketches were studied like sacred texts. Every crossing out, every revision, every marginal note analysed for insight into the creative process. The conversation books became historical documents. Museums fought over artefacts. His ear trumpets, his piano, his desk. Ordinary objects transformed into relics through association with genius. The mythology building began immediately. Writers invented stories. The 3 Knocks of Fate. The Moonlight Sonata, written for a blind girl. The letter to the immortal beloved, discovered and endlessly speculated about. Some stories had kernels of truth. Most were romantic embellishment, but they served a purpose. They made Ludwig accessible. The real man was complicated, often unpleasant, sometimes cruel. The mythical figure was noble, suffering, heroic. People preferred the myth. Schubert died the following year, 1828. He'd revered Ludwig, attended the funeral, asked to be buried nearby. His wish was granted. The 2 greatest composers of the era lie in Vienna's central cemetery. Their graves side by side now, though they barely knew each other in life. Schubert's music is so different. Lyrical, where Ludwig was dramatic. Intimate, where Ludwig was public. Yet both transformed what music could be. The generation after Ludwig struggled with his shadow. Schumann loved him, studied him obsessively, but felt crushed by the comparison. How do you write symphonies after the ninth? How do you write string quartets after Opus 132? The answer was to go different directions. Schumann embraced character pieces, song cycles, piano miniatures. Mendelssohn returned to classical elegance. Chopin ignored orchestras entirely, focused on solo piano. Each found their path by not competing directly with Ludwig's achievements. Wagner took the opposite approach. He didn't avoid the challenge, he transformed it. He declared the symphony finished, exhausted by Ludwig's ninth. The future, Wagner insisted, was music drama, opera that synthesized all the arts. Ludwig had pointed toward the union of music and text in the ninth's finale. Wagner would complete that synthesis. Whether he succeeded is debatable, but his confidence was absolute. He saw himself as Ludwig's heir, the next revolutionary. Brahms took decades to write his first symphony because he felt Ludwig's presence too strongly. "You have no idea how it feels when that giant marches behind you," he told a friend. When he finally published the first in 1876, nearly 50 years after Ludwig's death, critics immediately called it Beethoven's 10th. Brahms hated that, but he understood it. He'd absorbed Ludwig so completely that the influence was inescapable. Yet the symphony is unmistakably Brahms, warmer, more lyrical, less driven. The anxiety of influence produced something new. The recordings changed everything again. Suddenly people could hear the same performance repeatedly. Before recordings, every concert was unique, unrepeatable. You heard the symphony once, maybe twice if you were lucky. Now you could play it whenever you wanted. That seems like pure gain. But something was lost too. The live concert's immediacy. The awareness that this specific performance would never happen again. Recordings preserved but also froze. Certain interpretations became canonical simply because they were recorded early and widely distributed. Furtwängler's wartime recordings of the ninth are controversial. Recorded in Berlin during Nazi rule, they're extraordinary performances. But the context makes people uncomfortable. Should we separate art from historical circumstances? Can we listen to these recordings without thinking about the regime that sponsored them? Ludwig would have hated the association. His music was used to glorify a government that represented everything he opposed. That's not his fault, but it complicates the legacy. The Soviet Union claimed Ludwig too. His music was officially approved, considered ideologically acceptable. Unlike Shostakovich or Prokofiev, who faced censorship, Ludwig's works were always safe to perform. Revolutionary credentials, no dangerous modernism. The ninth became an unofficial anthem. The heroic struggle, the victory, the brotherhood of man. It fit the communist narrative perfectly. East German concert halls played Ludwig constantly. So did West German ones. Both sides claimed him as theirs. The ninth's finale at the Berlin Wall's fall was inevitable. Bernstein conducted it on Christmas Day, 1989, changing Freude to Freiheit, joy to freedom. German reunification needed a soundtrack. Ludwig provided it. The music that celebrated universal brotherhood accompanied a specific political moment. That's how art works. It means what the moment needs it to mean. The scholarly industry never stops. New biographies appear regularly. New critical editions of the music. New theories about the deafness, the personality, the relationships. The immortal beloved identity remains disputed. Candidates come and go. Each biographer favours a different woman, builds a case, declares the mystery solved. Then the next biographer dismantles that case and proposes someone else. We'll probably never know for certain. The letter was never sent. No name appears, the evidence is fragmentary. Does it matter? The music exists independent of biographical details. Yet people keep searching because they want to understand genius. If we could identify the immortal beloved, maybe we'd understand Ludwig better. Maybe we'd understand how suffering transforms into beauty. That's the hope anyway. The reality is simpler. We have the music. That's what survived. Everything else is speculation. The late quartets remain the summit. Not the most popular works. Those are the symphonies. But the quartets represent Ludwig at his most uncompromising. No concessions to audience expectations. No attempt to please. Just a deaf man writing music he couldn't hear, for instruments he understood completely. The viola in Opus 131. The first violin in Opus 135. He knew their ranges, their capabilities, their colours. He wrote parts that only make sense played on strings. No piano could do this, no orchestra either. Just 4 instruments in conversation. That's the final paradox. The most isolated composer, the man who couldn't hear anything, created music that's all about communication. The quartets are dialogues. Instruments talk to each other, interrupt, agree, argue, reconcile. It's human interaction, translated into sound. Someone completely cut off from human conversation understood it better than anyone. The music will outlive the myths. Centuries from now, when the biographical details have blurred into legend, when nobody remembers the conversation books or the nephew or the immortal beloved, the symphonies will still exist. The quartets will still be played. The piano sonatas will still challenge performers. Not because Ludwig suffered, though he did. Not because he was deaf, though he was. Because the music is that good. Because he solved problems nobody else could solve. Because he expanded what music could express. 2 things fill the mind with ever-increasing wonder: the starry heavens above and the moral law within. Kant wrote that. Ludwig might have agreed. He looked up at those stars during his walks in the countryside. He wrestled with the moral law in every piece he wrote. The 2 aren't separate. Beauty and truth, feeling and thought, sound and meaning. Ludwig showed they could be one thing. That's the achievement. That's what survives. The manuscripts scattered across Europe tell us something the music alone cannot. Every crossing out reveals a choice. Every revision shows a mind that never accepted good enough. The Opus 131 sketches exist in the British Library. You can see Ludwig trying the opening fugue 12 different ways before finding the version that worked. Nothing was inevitable. Everything was fought for. That's what separates genius from talent. Talented composers write beautiful music. Geniuses rewrite it 40 times until it transcends beauty entirely and becomes necessary. The difference is audible. You can hear it in the Grosse Fuge, in the Hammerklavier's finale, in the 9th choral entrance. These moments don't sound like choices, they sound like discoveries, like Ludwig found something that was already there, waiting. But he didn't find it. He built it, measure by measure, revision by revision, sketch after sketch. The work was unglamorous, sitting at a desk, crossing things out, trying again. No divine inspiration, no muse whispering in his ear, just a deaf man wrestling with notation until the page matched what he heard internally. The conversation books will keep getting published, the sketches will keep getting analysed, new biographies will propose new theories, the scholarly apparatus will churn forever. That's fine. Understanding deepens through repeated examination. But at some point, you have to stop reading about the music and actually listen to it. Put on the cavatina from Opus 130. Don't read the program notes first. Don't worry about what it means or what Ludwig intended. Just listen. 6 minutes of string quartet that will either move you or it won't. If it does, you'll understand why people care. If it doesn't, no amount of biographical context will help. The music stands alone. That's the test it has to pass. 200 years later, in a world Ludwig couldn't have imagined, played on instruments he never heard. For audiences who know nothing about Viennese aristocrats, or Napoleon, or the Congress of Vienna. Does it still work? Obviously it does. Concert halls still program the symphonies. Pianists still tackle the sonatas. String quartets still wrestle with Opus 135. Not because Ludwig was a hero or a martyr or a symbol, because the music is structured in ways that make human sense. The themes develop logically. The harmonies resolve satisfyingly. The rhythms drive forward with purpose. Technical excellence combined with emotional truth. That's the formula. Thousands of composers have tried it. A handful succeeded. Ludwig succeeded more completely than almost anyone. The deafness narrative will never go away. It's too dramatic, too perfect. Composer who can't hear writing transcendent music. That's the hook that draws people in. Fine, use whatever hook works. But once you're in, once you're actually listening, the deafness becomes irrelevant. The music isn't about deafness, it's about everything else. Struggle and triumph, yes, but also joy, humour, tenderness, rage, peace. The full spectrum. The Fifth Symphony isn't about fate knocking at the door. That's a story someone made up later. The music is about how 4 notes can generate an entire symphonic movement through development and variation. The drama is in the structure, not the program. Understanding that takes work, but the work pays off. Once you hear how Ludwig builds those massive movements from tiny motives, you can never unhear it. The architecture becomes visible. The late works require even more patience. They don't announce their meanings. They don't seduce casual listeners. They demand attention, concentration, willingness to follow musical arguments that span 20 minutes without resolution. Most people won't bother. That's okay. Ludwig wasn't writing for most people. He was writing for himself, for posterity, for anyone willing to meet him halfway. 250 years after his birth, we're still catching up. The late quartets that baffled 19th century audiences make perfect sense now. The dissonances that seemed harsh have been normalized by a century of even harsher dissonances. The formal experiments that seemed chaotic now seem rigorous. Each generation hears something previous generations missed. That's how you know it's great art. It doesn't get exhausted. You can return to the Hammerklavier Sonata 50 times and still hear new things. The structure is so dense, the ideas so concentrated, that complete comprehension is impossible. There's always another layer, another connection, another implication you missed before. The influence question is ultimately pointless. Everyone who came after Ludwig was influenced by him. Even the composers who rejected him were responding to him. You can't ignore something that massive. It's like asking whether later architects were influenced by the invention of the arch. Of course they were. The question is what they did with it. What Ludwig did was show that music could be an intellectual and emotional experience simultaneously. Before him, those were mostly separate. Church music aimed for the soul. Court music entertained. Folk music expressed communal feeling. Ludwig created music that demanded your brain and your heart at the same time. Analysis and feeling weren't opposites, they reinforced each other. That integration is his real legacy. Not the specific pieces, though they're extraordinary. Not the innovations in form, though they're revolutionary. But the proof that music could be as complex as philosophy and as moving as poetry. That instrumental sound, organized according to abstract principles, could communicate as specifically as words. He didn't do it alone. Bach had explored musical architecture. Haydn had developed sonata form. Mozart had perfected classical balance. Ludwig stood on their shoulders, but he saw further. He took the tools they'd developed and pushed them until they broke, then rebuilt them stronger. The Ninth Symphony's premiere. That moment when the baritone cuts through 40 minutes of instrumental music to sing O Freunde, nicht diese Töne. That's the hinge. Everything before leads to it. Everything after flows from it. It's the moment when Ludwig says the old approaches aren't enough anymore. We need something new. Joy instead of struggle. Unity instead of conflict. Voices instead of just instruments. Whether it succeeds is almost beside the point. The audacity of trying is what matters. Who else would have dared? Who else would have thought a symphony could include a chorus singing Schiller's poetry? It shouldn't work. According to classical principles, it's category confusion. But Ludwig made it work through sheer compositional will. That's the lesson. Rules exist to be tested. Forms exist to be expanded. Tradition is a foundation, not a prison. Respect it, learn from it, then do something new. Don't break rules randomly. Break them because your musical ideas require it. There's a difference. One is rebellion for its own sake, the other is necessity. Vienna gave him a magnificent funeral because the city knew what it had lost. Not just a composer, but a force. Someone who'd expanded the possibilities of what music could be and do. His death marked an ending. The classical era was finished. The romantic era had arrived. Ludwig was the bridge between them, 1 foot in each world, transforming both. The grave in the central cemetery gets visitors constantly. People leave flowers, notes, tokens. They stand there and remember the music, or they discover it for the first time and want to pay respects. The deaf composer who changed everything, the difficult man who created beauty, the genius who earned it through work. His desk is in a museum. The ear trumpets he used trying to hear. The conversation books filled with one-sided dialogues. The manuscripts covered in revisions. All preserved, all studied, all evidence of a life lived in service to sound. Not a comfortable life, not a happy one particularly, but a meaningful one. He knew what he was here to do, and he did it completely. The music will keep playing. Orchestras will program the symphonies. Pianists will attempt the sonatas. String quartets will tackle the late works. Some performances will be transcendent. Some will be adequate. A few will be terrible. Ludwig won't care. He's beyond caring. The notes on the page are fixed. What performers do with them is their problem. And somewhere tonight, someone is listening to the ninth finale for the first time. The choral entrance is approaching. The baritone is about to sing. The moment that changed music forever is about to happen again. Different listener, same revelation. The melody is simple enough that anyone can remember it. The message is clear enough that translation isn't necessary. Joy, brotherhood, the possibility that humanity might transcend its worst impulses. That was Ludwig's final gift, not certainty but possibility, the starry heavens above and the moral law within. He looked up at those stars during his walks outside Vienna. He wrestled with that moral law in every piece he wrote, both infinite, both mysterious, both beautiful. The deaf composer who heard everything that mattered, the isolated man who spoke to everyone, the genius who was also just a person, difficult and brilliant and impossible and necessary. That's who Ludwig van Beethoven was. Not a myth, not a symbol, but a human being who happened to be capable of extraordinary things. The music he left behind is the evidence. Everything else is commentary. Listen to the late quartets. Listen to the ninth. Listen to the hammerklavier. Then you'll understand why we're still talking about him 2 centuries later. Why we'll keep talking about him 2 centuries from now. The sound remains, everything else fades,